Thank you very much, Michael. Last panel of the day, and a fabulous topic to finish, which is looking forward to COP28. And here to do that with me, I have a fabulous panel and also, I hope, technology that works. In that we have joining us virtually Ambassador Mohamed Nasr, who is both the Director of the Climate, Environment and Sustainable Development at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Arab Republic of Egypt, but also Egypt's Chief Climate Negotiator. Welcome. Here on stage, we have Mattia Romani, who is the Senior Counselor to the Special Envoy on Climate Change and President-Designate of COP28. Pleased to be joined by Leslie White, Chief Operating Officer of the Sustainable Markets Initiative, and sitting next to me here, my good friend and mentor, Abyd Karmali, OBE, Managing Director, ESG and Sustainable Finance from the Bank of America. So let's get into it. If I may, I'm going to start with you, Ambassador, because I'd like just to take a quick look back. COP27, following COP27 in Egypt, what are the specific points you see which we now need to be actioned in the financial sector, and more widely, to ensure that we're really on a path to delivering on the agendas and outcomes that were set out in Sharm el-Sheikh?
Thank you so much, and I hope you can hear me well. And greetings from Bonn, where I'm attending the transitional committee that is tasked to operationalize the funding arrangements and the fund for the loss. And so greetings from Bonn, and apologies for not being with you. I wish I would be with you in the great city of London, but hopefully maybe next year or in the course of the year. Also, thanks for the City of London, Lord Mayor, for the partnership he's having with the COP27 presidency and in delivering this summit, the Net Zero Summit. It is a very important event that brings in the stakeholders. Very quickly, if I'm just responding to your question and what you have mentioned, let's be very clear that COP27 was, I would, not only because I'm the lead negotiator, but based on the outcomes and the participation from the different stakeholders, it was a historic COP. Not only participation, but also on the issues that were tackled, and some of them were for the first time, and the outcomes from the negotiating process. Of course, it did build on what we had in COP27 in Glasgow. Glasgow provided first step for many of the work that we did in COP27, and we believe that in COP28 will be building more incremental process. For us, on the finance side, I think the call for the MDBs, was one of the major elements that came out in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. The call was not only just a call to reform, but it was a call to reform based on or with a target to achieve on three main elements. The first one is to additionality, so we need to raise the scale of climate finance through the MDBs. And the second element was to enhance the access and facilitate the access of developers to the MDB resources. And the third one is to consider the concessionality and the concessional instruments rather than doing the business as usual, which will not take us on the speed and the scale that is envisaged. So with that, there was a response from the IFIs and the first meetings that was there early, I think in March or April this year. The second element was, again, strong focus on enhancing the existing mechanism. So there was a clear call for increasing the Green Climate Fund, which happens this year. The Green Climate Fund scale in the past 4 years was 10.1 billion. This is almost 2.5 per year. And the call was very clear that we need to respond to science and we need to provide further resources not only for public finance, but also for the private sector. And I think this very strong call was received with a lot of interest, and we saw Germany increasing their contribution by 23%. The US coming back to the GCF was 1 billion. Austria and others have increased their contributions by more than 15 and 20%. So this was also reflected on. The third element was the loss and damage, the creation of the loss and damage funding arrangements and the fund, which we are operationalizing now, and a very important element, responding to the calls of communities and really delivering on the loss and damage component. Together with that, this was coupled mitigation with a very clear direction on energy. And energy, we heard throughout the year in the COP that energy is the cornerstone for the transition that was envisaged. The call for the first time in the cover decision, the share of renewable energy in the energy mix, and I believe that we will be building on that in COP28. This was on the negotiating track. This was again put together with a very important component, and it was a call based on what we have seen in the Just Transition programs by a creation of a Just Transition program, social and economic of the transition that was envisioned under the Paris Agreement towards the global carbon neutrality by 2050. And we know that in many developing countries and developed countries, there will be a lot of these, but there will also be challenges when it comes to this transition. And that's why the Just Transition Work Program be exploring the possibilities and the solutions for the social and economic challenges that might be facing developing countries, which we already saw. On the action agenda, which again is part of the holders' engagement together with Mr. Nigel from the UK and Dr. Mahmoud Mohideen from Egypt, I think we work with through the presidency to deliver on the thematic days, very new thematics. One was a decarbonization day. For the first time ever, we had a focus day on the decarbonization energy intensive industry. Our aim as presidency was to build the bridge between energy intensive industry and what is being discussed, climate change in the phasing out or phasing in and reducing the carbon footprint and shifting to the net zero. And I think it was a very meeting where you had representatives from the sectors and produce cement, steel, oil and gas, among others. And they have provided, many of those who have taken this net zero approach have provided their experience, and I think it was a very good step to ensure that is really doing the transformation that was envisaged. But having said that, our expectation for this year, we need to also to know that this year we are having very critical meetings, and we believe that the private sector will be like a major player on that. Those meetings, starting with the summit that we're having in France on finance and development, including climate finance, which will be looking at the innovation and innovative sources and how can we deal with the issues of debt. Then we have the summits that will be organized by the Secretary General in New York, especially on the Ambition Summit and the SDG Summit, which all now are interlinked. And then there is the expectation, not only from the public sector, but also from the international financial institutions, where a response from the IFIs, international financial institutions, including the MDBs, is expected to respond to the strong call for reform, and a reform that delivers on the three elements and not for the sake of reforms. We are also seeing that in the reality, what is telling us and what the assessment is that we need at least $1 trillion of investments per year if we want to go in the path of achieving an increased share of renewable. And if going towards the keeping the 1.5 alive and the net zero approach early on, then we would need around $4 trillion of investments per year in the different countries. We also have the number of the NDCs, which developing countries have put forward, and the cost of those NDCs up to 2030 is $5.6 to $5.7 trillion. So what do we need to deliver this year? I think from the non-parties, we need to deliver on the race to zero. We need to deliver on the clear indicators that investments are flowing, and the issue of the increasing cost of finance, which is a major for countries to attract investments, is it in the right way, and that the international community, when it comes to the private sector and private investors and sovereign funds, are acting as one towards keeping the 1.5 alive, towards pushing investments for the transition in the energy sector and in transport, in the agriculture sector. We know the major to adaptation finance, and this is something that we still need to deal with as international communities. Still, until now, adaptation is very limited, and those are the most impacted people. Areas like agriculture and other adaptation fisheries, among others. And we need to deliver on the Just Transition Work Program. So we provide the policymakers in developing countries assurances that then in the transition, the communities will not be negated as being envisaged, but we will find the solutions to provide the social safety and that in the workforce, and deliver also on social and economic benefits. Those were the main things. On the other hand, I think we should be very clear that decarbonization should be a focus. As Ambassador Magid just mentioned, we need to look at the future of new energy sources on green hydrogen and how can we ensure that it is taking part of it. We need to look at how the industries are really working in the decarbonization carbon market, the real change in their production process. And we need to ensure this is happening across. So it is not only in developed countries, and developing countries are being left, and there is an inequality happening, but to deliver an inclusive process. And this is where I think the challenge will be, and this is where I want to see more from the private sector putting forward those assurances. So it is about going to carbon neutrality. It's about ensuring resilience. It is doing the decarbonization. It is the flows of finance to all particular developing countries. And here we need to highlight that Africa, for example, has only attracted almost 1% of the global investment. With all the resources that Africa has, it has only attracted 1%. So we need to work on to deal with this bottle, the challenges, the high cost of risks in countries, and then deliver that. COP28, I think the GST will be a major point. We will look backwards on what we have pledged, but also what we have implemented. We will look forward on what we need to deal with, but also what kind that we need to provide as a catalyst for the implementation on the ground. Rounds and rounds of hedging does not have environment. It has communities at the forefront of the climate impact. It is implementation that will make a difference. And we hope that the focus will continue on how can we make things happen on the ground together with raising the ambition cycle. I'll stop there. And again, thank you so much for the invitation. Apologies for not being with you, but it is a very good opportunity to excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and this very precious crowd. So thank you.
Much, Ambassador, for joining us virtually. The line was breaking up a little, but I think in your very wide-ranging answer, you touched on so many points that I'm sure we can expand on in the rest of our panel. I particularly like the focus on practicality, the concessional instruments, the point about specific contributions to the GCF fund, as well as the L&D, and the emphasis on needing to look at different sectors through your thematic days and the importance of the race to zero. And let's not forget the importance of resilience as well as decarbonisation. And of course, the points that you're making about developing countries as well as developed countries are absolutely key. So plenty for us to pick up on there, Mattia. But it'd be really interesting if you could build on that with what are the key finance priorities that the presidency hopes to advance at COP28?
Well, thank you very much, Ryan. And I have an easy task because Ambassador Majid has laid them out for us. But it's really a 4 times 3. There's 4 pillars to the finance agenda for COP28. The first one is IFI reforms. And here it's really about identifying what COP28 can do to encourage IFI reforms to really work for climate action. So to ensure that we move away from this dichotomy between climate and development. We agree that climate and poverty reduction are one and the same. They're 2 sides of the same coin. And how do we want to prioritize IFI reforms to ensure that the IFIs and DBs really can gear up to have the maximum impact on climate action most urgently? So that's one. The second one, which is complementary to that, is on leveraging private finance. And here, it's really about what have we learned from the fact that we haven't managed really to leverage private finance at scale to flow to emerging and developing countries on climate action. Ambassador Majid put it very, very well. And about, on a good day, 20% of the yearly flows of climate finance end up in emerging developing countries, 80% flow to developed rich countries. We need to turn that around. So what can we do at COP28? What have we learned from what hasn't worked in the past, and what can we fix? So that's the second one. The third one is carbon markets, and volatile carbon markets in particular. How can this become a massive resource for financial flows to emerging and developing countries? Not a marginal source, a large source of financing to emerging and developing countries. And what are the obstacles that we face on that? And we know there are many obstacles, and some of them are legitimate. They're complicated issues that will require some difficult decisions to be made. These are not simple, straightforward issues. To what extent should we suggest that offsets are used by corporates to meet their net zero goals? Nothing, all of it, somewhere in between. And the somewhere in between may determine whether the scale of finance to developing and emerging markets that are able to provide those offsets is very large or very small. So difficult questions like that will need to be tackled. That's the third one. And the fourth one is financing innovation. And I think, again, Ambassador Majid put it very, very well. This is not about discovering the next amazing technology. This is about deploying technologies which are on the verge of being commercial, but they require that push to really be scaled up. And how do we accelerate those S-curves? How do we accelerate the exponential growth? And that's something that the UAE has substantial experience on. So they bring their Masdar experience. Dr. Sultan, the COP president designate, ran Masdar for 15 years. So he knows something about that, and he's very keen on that element of the story. So these are the four pillars, but I said 4 times 3. There's also the how.
Yes.
And the 3 elements of the how are, first, complement, not substitute. So this is not about delivering on this for competing with others, but it's about bringing others with you and seeing where are the gaps and how can COP28 fill in those gaps. So, for example, on IFI reforms, there's many, many places that are very well placed to suggest action on IFI reforms. This is about what can COP28 usefully add to that debate, or on mobilizing private finance. There's a lot of very good work going on. What can we do at COP28 to complement that? So this is about being complementary and as opposed to substitute or compete. That's the first nature of the second. The second is we really are not looking for marginal change. We're looking for step changes. We're looking for being able to create change at scale across these four areas. I don't think the COP presidency will be happy with some marginal tinkering of the results. We want to identify things that can really make a difference. And the third and last is we need to deliver by November. So that really reduces the ambition to practical deliverables that we know between now and then we can at least get going. And I would just add on this last point, and again, Dr. Sultan and Ambassador Majid are very clear on this. There's a real desire to think about this COP as one of a series of COPs for a multi-COP agenda of delivery. I think there's a real desire to set roadmaps that are multi-COP and that can go on to COP29 and COP30 and further, which doesn't mean you don't need to deliver by November. You still need to deliver by November, but you do it holding hands with future COP presidencies to ensure that there's continuity. And I think what Ambassador Nasr pointed out is exactly the right spirit, and having COP26 and 27 before us makes that task easier because they've laid out the ground for some of the deliverables around the 4 areas I've highlighted.
That focus on potentially having a multi-COP agenda, that really does sound like a refreshing approach and one that is very, very outcomes focused. Thank you so much for setting things out in such a structured fashion. I think we're going to hear more from Prime Minister Mia Mottley on the IFI reforms. She's obviously doing so much on that agenda following this panel, and certainly on leveraging private finance. That's something that a number of us in this room have been focused on, not least of which Abyd, who's been working on this agenda for many years at Bank of America. So maybe if I could turn to you, of those things, which are those elements that excite you, and are there other things that you think are going to be of real interest going into COP28, speaking as a banker?
Yeah, so first of all, can I say this is music to my ears. I think this is, first of all, very well laid out, so thanks for that. And look, I think at Bank of America, we'd never viewed the Paris Agreement as a climate deal. It's basically a framework for future financial flows. And helpfully, in COP27 and the Sharm el-Sheikh Agreement, that was actually quantified in the cover decision, roughly 4 to 6 trillion on an annual basis. So that's sort of the preface. And then, as we look to COP28 specifically, I think we're looking at 3 major buckets. The first is the stocktake. The second is Article 6, the market mechanisms. And the third is the suite of activities that go with Article 2.1c, I think it is, which is alignment of all the financial flows. So let me just touch on each and explain why I think it's important. On the stocktake, I mean, I haven't seen any drafts, but I'm anticipating the storyline will be we have a massive ambition gap, we have a massive implementation gap that is contributing to this large financial gap. And I guess from a private sector perspective, we would like to know, and it helps that I think the attention will then be on beyond the missing pieces. We want to know how specifically will the gap on green premiums between BAU technologies and the low carbon technologies be bridged. Mm-hmm. The second point is, it's about, as we think about kind of longer term step changes in technology, how are those step changes going to be done in a smooth manner? And the third area is likely to be around adaptation finance, and this was touched on as well in the ambassador's comments actually. The private sector has appetite to invest in climate resilience, and we've been doing a little bit ourselves. We know that there's interest from institutional investors. We've arranged a sustainability bond for the government of the Philippines, $700 million. Part of the use of proceeds was focused specifically on improving resilience in infrastructure. We've invested our own balance sheet in the Insure Resilience Debt Fund, which is focused on micro weather insurance for smallholder agricultural communities in emerging markets, something quite niche, but where there is clearly a suitable risk return and impact. So look, I think that's some of the pieces on the global stocktake. On Article 6, so I've been amazed actually in this day to day. We haven't heard anything about the compliant carbon markets. And maybe I feel bad because my first role in banking was actually running the old carbon credit business, but it was 99.9% compliance market, and the pimple at the end was the voluntary market. And somehow we're in this valley now where the voluntary market is getting all the attention. But don't forget, back then we had a market that showed how to deliver a leveraging factor of roughly 4 to 1. That's not my statistic, that's the United Nations' own statistic. Every dollar that was delivered on carbon credits through the Clean Development Mechanism managed to leverage 4 into emerging markets. So it can be done. It can help to scale up massively. And so we need to see progress on Article 6 specifically. The third point then is around this sort of suite that the Article 2.1c. Now, this is where, in the Paris Agreement terms, I would say this is where we go from the prefix, the $100 billion focus, to the a la carte, which is how you move the trillions. And that's more interesting. And Matteo, you laid out several, interesting things on the menu. So I would say things that are interesting for us, number one, MDB reform. Why? Because this is exactly how more private capital can be engaged. We've seen that through our own blended finance catalyst pool. We would not be investing in energy access or climate-smart agriculture in emerging markets unless, the foresightedness of some of the DFIs who've helped to de-risk that for us. KfW gets a special mention, and there are others. The second point is innovation. Now, one of the most interesting things for us at COP, I think it was 27, maybe 26, the Energy Transition Accelerator is a really interesting idea of how you can get jurisdictional carbon credits in the energy sector. The mechanism is being worked on. Our CEO is sitting on the high-level consultative group. But in simple terms, if you can deliver jurisdictional change in the energy sector and then use that as a means of financing the accelerated phase-out of things like coal power, while attracting the private sector to invest in the clean stuff, that is, I think, that meets the test of transformational. And then the third area, which I have to mention, I'm on the task force for nature-related financial disclosure, TNFD. I think everyone knows the acronym. So I have to say, look, the journey to net zero has to go roughly 30% through nature-positive outcomes. So what I would like to see in the COP28 decision is some kind of I don't know what the right legal term would be, but a shout-out, in simple terms, for the TNFD as a means of beginning the journey of disclosing nature-related risks and opportunities, which will help the private sector shift flows to nature-positive.
Fantastic. A really comprehensive answer. Thank you so much. And I think that point you were making about the CDM and the compliance market and the 4-to-1 leverage, I think it very much goes to the point that you were making, Mathieu, about let's look at things that are working. Let's be complementary. Let's be additional. We do have solutions out there that have worked. It isn't all about announcing new things all the time. It is about actually taking stock and trying to replicate and scale some of the solutions that we have seen work. And that, I don't just mean in the carbon markets, I mean right across the whole agenda. So again, very refreshing to hear you say that that's your sort of how, that the way that you're thinking about doing the how, not just the what. There's so much there. I'd love to come back to a number of points, but I really wanted to bring in Leslie because I think you sit in such an interesting position, Leslie. Your day job, you're a banker, but you have been running as the COO, the Sustainable Markets Initiative now for a while. And actually, before we ask questions about Sustainable Markets Initiative, I think it'd be helpful for the audience and those online who may not be as familiar about the mandate and the aims, if you were to just give a quick intro.
Okay, thank you, Rhian. And just thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And this is Sustainable Markets Initiative, very proud to be supporting the summit. Yep, I am a banker by trade. For the past year, I've been seconded from Bank of America into the Sustainable Markets Initiative as the Chief Operating Officer. Just a little bit of background. If you think about sort of realising sort of the impact to the environment, socio-economic impact of climate change and the biodiversity loss back in 2020 at Davos, King Charles, then His Royal Highness Prince of Wales, launched the Sustainable Markets Initiative. And then as an organisation that was co-chaired by then His Royal Highness, now King Charles, and Brian Monahan, who is the CEO of Bank of America. And really the purpose is to really deliver to its aim is to bring the efforts and the leadership of the private sector to accelerate towards the transition. And we do this by delivering to the Terra Carta. Some of you may be familiar with the SMI, but that's really made up of 10 principles and actions. I see it as the SMI being the how and the Terra Carta roadmap being the what. And at the moment, we currently have 180 active CEOs engaged across 21 task forces. I run the Secretariat as the COO, and pretty much how it works is we really operate across 3 pillars. So it's industry, finance, and country. And I think that's the uniqueness of the SMI, and combining and collaborating all of that to help deliver to the challenges and drive action that we've talked about today. The industry groups I call the verticals. If you think about energy, aviation, agriculture, transport, hospitality and tourism, you name it, we have those industry groups working collectively together. And then we have a number of enabling task forces. So think about finance, asset management, insurance, technology, measurement and transparency, just as examples. And all of those task forces are led by CEOs of the largest global companies in the world, so there's a global remit there. And they work collectively with also our country engagement team. So the benefit of having previously His Royal Highness engaged more formally. We could lean into the Commonwealth. We would be introduced to all countries of the Commonwealth and beyond through the High Commissioners to really engage locally with those local governments, understand what the country needs are, what the challenges are, and then bring some of those challenges back into facilitating those discussions and introductions to the private sector. So the private sector not only can help when it comes to mentoring and has the industry experience, but also when it comes to deploying capital and allocating balance sheet for some of those key projects and mobilising some of that financing is where the SMI plays a key role. And just on top of that, we've just introduced a sustainable investment team, which really is looking to deliver a project development unit, which again is global. And we would do that through some of the partnerships that we and alliances that we have with other organisations. But that also creates another pipeline, if you like, of projects. Now, whilst we're not a certified organisation like us as bankers, in my previous role, the whole key opportunity there is to bring the project sponsors together, help them with the project tools that we have to get those projects climate eligible to a point, and then ask our private sector supporters to then lean in and help to take those projects to the next level. And just today, I think what's really key, is the partnership with the private sector, the alliances and the partnerships that we have and that we've built. And I think just today is a great example. Our insurance task force just launched an alignment with the Resilient Cities Fellowship, a programme where we are putting called it second insurance expertise into 5 countries across 5 cities in the global north and the global south to really go in and work with city leadership to advise on how to de-risk, in sort of the built environment space. So that's a good example of some of the things that I think having the power of the CEOs in the room, the influence of that voice really helps drive action forward.
Thanks for that, Leslie. And tying that into the COP28 agenda in particular, that convening power you have, how can you maybe leverage the SMI's position to help that translate to success at COP28? In particular, I was thinking about the point that Mattia was making about financial innovative new sectors and new technologies, and perhaps that's something that the SMI could be focused on too.
Yeah, and I think I think the private sector does it does a lot anyway, but I think the SMI, obviously bringing it more centrally, helps even more so. And I think I'm really looking forward to see. I've only done one COP, so I'm probably a bit of a novice in the room here compared to everybody else, and one Davos. But I think it's really great to sort of hear about the fact that there will be, hopefully, a larger contingent of private sector presence in Dubai. We were there in Egypt. We had probably 45 of our CEOs with us in the room, and really trying to move a lot of what we've done from frameworks, papers into real action. And I think really becoming that do tank and then having those people in the room to really sort of make those decisions and move forward. I think with some of the innovation, whether that's technology, if you think about the innovation in technology or some of the innovation that's coming through some of these small startups, if you like, one of the things we're trying to do is, and soon to launch, is an early stage funding task force. So I look at it as a banker, how a company comes to you first time round and needs some support and help to set up and mature. I think we can start with some of those early stage funding opportunities, and as those solutions, as those companies, as those technologies mature, because it's hard for them to get that financing from the big finance institutions from day one. So how can we evolve and help those small companies and the technologies achieve their goals through that cycle of support, if you like, over time?
That sounds like a really exciting initiative. I'm taking my prerogative.
It's not yet launched.
Prerogative is being
told
the
off by the
moderator to say, that's also incredibly important, that early stage financing, when we look at the nature-based solutions, possibly even more so. We have so much knowledge and intellectual IP that sit in environmental NGOs that struggle to find investment. One of the things that we've done at the Green Finance Institute is work with the UK government to set up an investment readiness fund. We've done it with the Westminster government. now done it with the Scottish Government. We're in discussions with some other governments to do it as well, precisely to address the issue that exists both in technology but exists particularly in nature. And I felt compelled to mention it because of our work on TNFD. I wanted to come back to you, Matthew, if I may. Abyd mentioned the Global Stocktake. That's obviously a huge feature of COP28, where we'll be seeing how various countries are lining up with the commitments that they've made under the Paris Agreement. What are some of the specific calls to action that you think may come out for the financial sector that might come out of us doing the Global Stocktake in this way at this COP?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I, like Abyd, I'm not party of the early results on the stocktake, so I can't give you the scoop on that. But I suspect I would come to similar conclusions that it's very likely that we'll find ourselves short of our ambitions, and that will increase the sense of urgency. So what can we do with that increased sense of urgency? How can we use that negative energy and transform it into a call for action? And this, on the finance side, there's several things that can be done, but I'd like to build on one that really, if you want, echoes what Leslie was just saying now. I think Ambassador Majid, in his speech just a few minutes ago, mentioned how it is essentially, in order to mobilize private finance in emerging and developing countries, help reduce the actual or perceived risk of doing business in emerging developing countries. And it is on that perceived risk that I think a call of action for the private sector should come. And the call of action is on increasing presence on the ground, increasing the way in which data on the actual risk is shared, so that increasingly that sort of boots on the ground experience can reduce that perceived risk, and with that reduce the cost of capital in developing and emerging countries. I think if there's one thing that I'd love to see coming out of that COP28 is a commitment to have that presence in emerging developing countries from the global financiers. And that can come hand in hand with some help on managing some of the risks in the early stages, but it's a gradual process, right? And I love, Leslie, that you guys are putting people on the ground on that risk mitigation in different sectors. I think that's really great, and we should follow up on that. I'd love to learn more about that. So if I had to pick one that is very close to my heart, and it comes from the fact that I spent a chunk of my life at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and EBRD is famous for its bankers on the ground and its boots on the ground, and I can see how that reduces the risk perception, encourages project preparation, and most of the bankers at EBRD, in fact, were local bankers. EBRD hired local bankers and hires local bankers in its countries of operations in order to learn from the existing network and strengthen it. And that was an invaluable proposition for the bank's ability to source projects and finance projects. So that's the one I'd pick.
Thank you for picking one. I'm going to your point about the perceived risk. Maybe one of the things we'd like to see under MDB reform is that they publish their default rates. Because, as you say, these developing banks have been pioneers in funding these types of infrastructure projects and other projects in countries where the perceived risk is very high by the commercial sector.
Good push. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Let's push on that. Well, we have a new president.
Happy to support you.
I'll be on his list. I'm sure he's got a long list, I suspect.
I'm sure we do. Just final word then to you, Abyd, and what lessons for COP28 do you think you could share from the work that Bank of America has been pioneering, in particular the $1.5 trillion sustainable finance commitment that you have? You've got the balance sheet. What lessons can we learn from B of A on some of this?
Well, I'll pick three. I think the first is you have to take a whole-of-bank approach. It really is about all geographies, all lines of business, all financial products. To try and embed, climate considerations across the whole piece. And, the sort of the result of that to date is that we've managed to deploy, I think it's 447 billion as of the end of last year. But that's also come about because we've helped train up all of our global corporate investment bankers, and work is underway with our global commercial bank, so the next tier of banking. And once you have all of the bankers trained, they are obviously in a position to then engage with clients, look for those opportunities across the client's value chain. So that's the first. The second is, it is much easier, and it's probably obvious, but it's easier to deploy capital in markets with investment-grade policy.
Of course.
Now, we heard a little bit earlier from the US Treasury, Elizabeth Lean, and she mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. What we've seen with the launch of the ERA is huge amounts of interest from clients, not just in the US, but actually in Europe, in Asia, focusing on the huge opportunities created by that piece of legislation. And essentially, other countries, whether it's developed countries or emerging markets, need to show their cards as well. And I think that's part of that's one of the possible outcomes of the global stocktake is, how countries will bridge that, as I called it earlier, the green premium. Now, the other point that comes with that, and this is one of our experiences, it's really important not just to have the policies in place, but to think about barriers that get in the way of having more low-carbon infrastructure in the ground soon. Mm-hmm. So we're in the UK, I'll say it, planning reform, absolutely fundamental to scaling up low-carbon kit here. And I'm sure that's not unique to the UK. And then the last point is at least half of that 4 to 6 trillion that's mentioned in the Sharm el-Sheikh agreement has to be destined for emerging markets. And so to your point, Matteo, we've seen huge opportunities in the emerging markets. We don't have as much of a footprint from a Bank of America perspective, but in places where we do, some of the most exciting deals that I can speak to, I think it was an $8 billion listing of an Indian renewable company. Quite recently, the IPO of an Indonesian battery manufacturing company, that's strong in nickel. So the opportunities abound. You heard earlier from the CEO of the African Finance Corporation. So we were one of the banks that helped arrange, some of the Eurobond financing. There is no shortage of opportunity. You just need to look across your footprint and try and engage.
Yeah, that's a very optimistic note. I was fortunate enough to actually travel to the UAE with Lord Mayor and some other finance industry representatives not long ago, and was really struck at the investment that has taken place and the innovation. I think already solar photovoltaic is the cheapest in the UAE than it is in the world, and weren't stopping there. It was how do we now use the solar power to create hydrogen, to create ammonia. And a number of the discussions were about partnerships with Africa, with India, with countries that unfortunately quite often in our climate discussion we view as victims of climate change and not as the opportunity for investment, innovation and future-looking opportunity for us all. So I think on that note, I think we might be timing out, but I wanted to thank all of you. Thank you very much to the Ambassador for joining us. And if we could all put our hands together and thank the panel for a forward-looking and optimistic discussion. Thanks, guys.